and Marie, I don't think I asked either of you this. Are there any particular clauses or any particular documents that you guys want me to dive into today?
No, I didn't have anything.
Specific? Okay.
No.
Mark, there may be one thing, the open house visitors form. I held an open house this last weekend. I am also the seller, and it was kind of conflicting to get somebody to sign that because anything they said was telling the agent, but it was also telling the seller.
Okay. So just so I'm clear on it, so you held an open house, was it on your own personal property?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so when they said when you presented the form and said, you don't want representation, I'll show it to you, but I want you to know I'm representing the seller only and I'm the seller, they didn't want to sign it?
No, I didn't present that form at first. What I did, however, when they walked up was, "Hi, I happen to be the listing agent, and oh, by the way, I'm also the seller." So that was the release that I gave to them, and they didn't say anything that would have been confidential. But I did tell them that I am both the agent and the seller, and did not sign that form.
Okay. Okay. And so, I'll come back to that. Yeah, I mean, I think the rules might be a little bit different. As the seller, I don't think that you're required to have somebody that comes into your own home sign one of those disclosures. Um, but on the flip side, if you were the agent representing the seller only and the buyer decided that they didn't want to have you represent them on the showing, everything they told you could be passed along to the seller anyway. So I mean, because as the agent, basically you are the eyes and ears for the seller. So yeah, so we'll come back to that. That's a good one. Okay, well, welcome everybody for being here. I was just going through, looking for specific contract clauses that people might have an interest in hearing about, and didn't get much of a response from that. So I'm going to go with the notes that I have, which is I'm going to touch on highlights and things that I think are important for all agents, whether you're new or whether you're seasoned or whether you're a veteran. The contracts are really the most important thing that we do for our clients today. It's interesting, I wrote down in my notes here is that, we are not attorneys. And every time we talk with a client, we always have to say, if you want legal advice, you need to talk with an attorney. And then they say, well, what happens if I sign this document and we explain it to them? We're sort of acting as a real estate agent slash attorney without the ability to be an attorney. And yet, if we screw it up, guess what? We're in trouble, right? So it's really important that we pay attention to and know the contract forms and the things that we have. So, just some general things that I wanted to talk about as we get started. One of the habits that I used to have, and it's because of the different personality styles of clients that we have. Well, let me ask you this. Have you ever wanted to explain what you were doing with a contract and put it in front of somebody and they grabbed it out of your hand and said, "Let me sign it," and they didn't want to hear anything you had to say? Anybody have that happen?
Yeah.
Okay, it happens, probably, I don't know, 20% of the time people really don't really want to hear what you have to say with it. Have you ever had somebody sitting in front of you with a contract and you started to explain it to them and they didn't like your explanation and they sat there and read the contract in front of you? Has that happened to anybody?
No.
Never? Okay. It's happened to me. People will sit there and they will read through the stuff. That makes for a pretty long presentation to get an offer signed. So, and one of the notes that I would write down is you develop scripts and you develop ways to solve these issues with your clients, whether it's an objection or whether it's contracts. And so the question that I would ask people is I would say, would you like to read the documents before you sign them, hoping against hope that they will say no? I will say, are you familiar enough with the contracts that you really don't want to do anything other than sign them? That's the second option, and I hope to God they say no to that. And the third option is I say, would you like to hear the short version of what I'm asking you to sign or what you're signing? Would you like the short version? Okay. So the questions are, do you want to read it? Do you just want to sign? Or would you like the short version of the client or of the contract? And that's where I think probably 95% of the people come into it as they say, give me the short version of it. Okay. So it's important that we have language and dialogue and scripts that are accurate, short, and to the point with people that explains in language that they can understand what they're signing. So if I tell a layperson, when you sign this RPA, we're going to have to get some disclosures. We're going to get a TDS and an SPQ and a handful of other disclosures from the seller, and we're going to have 5 days to return it to them. Do they have any clue what we're talking about? Do they know what an SPQ is or a TDS or they don't. They don't know what those are. So one of the things that I would share with you when you are explaining things to people that are not attorneys and that are not real estate agents is that you don't use acronyms. Don't talk about MLS, don't talk about CMA because they don't know what those things are. Those are things that we talk about internally amongst each other. That's not what the clients are thinking about. Okay. So let's talk about presenting an offer to a client, and asking them to sign. There are going to be clauses that we are going to be using in probably 95% of every purchase agreement that we're doing. The price, the down payment, what percentage is it? What amount is it? What the loan amount is going to be, both the amount and what the percentage is. Is it 80% loan to value? Is it 400,000? I mean, you can talk about it in percentages. You can talk about it in gross numbers. What is the escrow period? How long do we have to close? Is it 30 days? Is it 45 days? The earnest money deposit amount is something that we would be talking about typically with somebody. The inspection periods, all of you know that our purchase agreements now have 17 days in there unless you modify them, basically for every single time frame. We have loan contingencies, we have appraisal contingencies, we have an arbitration clause that we typically ask them to initial. We have a liquidated damages clause that we like them to initial. There's a home warranty program that is offered. And there's also the final thing, which I would say is, quote, customary closing costs and who normally pays them. Does that make sense? It's what's customary. So an example that I would give you is the county transfer tax a seller's cost, or is it negotiable?
It's negotiable.
That's exactly right. It's negotiable. Now, in Big Bear, what's the common practice?
Seller pays.
Right. Okay. So have we ever had a negotiation where somebody that was writing an offer wrote in something that wasn't customary? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, I know it's irritating, but I think the reason that I bring that point up is that there are things that are normal and customary for us that are still negotiable. And if we keep our eye on the prize, if somebody says we want your buyer to pay the county transfer cost or the county transfer tax, it's just one more item in the negotiation that we have to do. And it's basically we're looking at net numbers. What is the net number the buyer is paying for it? And what's the nets the seller's getting for proceeds, if that makes sense. Okay. So it's important that we know what customary means versus what is a required cost. Okay. Does anybody have a cheat sheet that they use that they go over, or do they have a checklist of things that they discuss with a buyer when they're presenting the offer? Does anybody have that?
No, I just highlight things in the offer, like the main points, so that I make sure that I hit all those when I'm discussing it.
Okay. So describe, Sarah, when that happens. Are you face to face with them? Are you doing it over the phone, Zoom? How is that happening?
Usually just over the phone.
Okay. And are they usually looking at it at the same time?
No, I usually call them, discuss everything, and then tell them I'll send it over for them to review. So it's not so overwhelming. Like, here's the bullet points, but I'm going to send it over to you for your review.
Okay, good. Maureen.
I myself go line by line on the offer and make notes of the terms I want to express to them.
Okay.
And I do a very detailed email about the terms. And then next to each thing, I say if it's customary or standard, or we should counter this, or that's, whatever. So I itemize the term and give my recommendation, so to speak, and then in a very detailed email. And I keep that email because I want to make sure I have proof that I've explained everything.
Okay. Okay. That, and that's a good policy, both of them, and I think Sarah, I think what you're describing is probably the most common practice that I have had today. 40 years ago, people sat in front of you in your office and signed the offer. I mean, that was common practice 40 years ago, probably 30 years ago as well. But now it's almost never do you write the offer right in front of the customer. The customer says, yeah, we want to make an offer on the house, and you'll say, well, what terms do you want to offer? And you go through that list. You go through the price, the down payment, the escrow period, the earnest money amount. You go through all of those items, and they tell you what they want to make in their offer, and then you present the offer to them based on those terms. Okay.
I'm sorry. I was referring to if I got an offer on behalf of a seller, not writing the offer for a buyer.
Okay.
Sorry about
that. And that's good as well. That's good as well, because we represent both buyers and sellers.
Yeah.
So there's 2 points that I want to make as I go through this, particularly for Eric, being new, is that when you hear two seasoned agents that have a different process to how they go about their business, it talks to the entrepreneurship of the way our business is operated. There are several ways to skin a cat, I guess is what I'm saying. So there's a lot of ways to do things right, and there's also ways to do things wrong. But the things that are right are what they have in common, which is explaining to the clients in a way that they understand what they're signing. So, question for the group is, what's the number one danger of a deal that looked like it was going really well, and then after you get into a problem in escrow, when your client blames you for something, what do they usually say happen? What do they usually say you didn't do?
You never told me.
You never told me. You never told me that. You never told me that. Okay. And that's it. And that's exactly it. So, part of the professionalism of being a professional real estate agent is not only knowing what the clauses mean, but it is communicating it to the client in a way that they understand, partly to keep ourselves out of trouble, but more so that they understand what they're doing. If that makes
Mark,
sense. Yes, go ahead, Bill.
it's sometimes hazardous to summarize a paragraph or a clause because we are trying to interpret what the lawyers have written. And if we interpret that wrong, or the client hears it wrong, then we're in trouble. We misrepresented what that paragraph actually says.
So, are you saying that we don't understand what the paragraph says, or we don't understand the intention of what our client or the other client is thinking?
I'm saying that if we read the words in the paragraph, that's what the lawyers have approved. If I try to summarize that and my summary is wrong in any magnitude, then I've not represented that paragraph well. I find that, I have uh, quick responses to each one of the paragraphs on the RPA and the listing agreement, so I can try to summarize that, but I have to practice that to make sure I really understand what that paragraph or clause says.
Beautiful. You're going right down the alley of what I wanted to do with this class today. So thank you for that, Bill. So, I started off by saying that, we're not attorneys. Um, so we're not allowed to give legal advice. And yet when our client says, what does that paragraph mean? And we tell them, um, we're liable if we screw up. So it's very, very important to make sure that we know what the contracts say. Um, and I'm going to say this from my experience, and I talk with a lot of real estate agents, from all over the place about offers. I think there's a good percentage of people that are licensees that don't have a clue what the purchase agreement says. And when they're asked, what does that mean? I would rather them say, I don't know, than to make up some of the stuff that they say. Okay. So the next point that I would make, with what you shared, Bill, was when you read that paragraph, um, it's written by attorneys. When your client reads that paragraph and they don't understand it, what's the best way to express it to them so that they get an accurate understanding of what's in the paragraph, without having them hire an attorney every single time? Because if I tell a client, I can't give you a legal advice, you better call an attorney to understand what that paragraph meant. So give me an example of, well, let me use the example of liquidated damages. When somebody asks you the question, um, how can I lose my deposit? How do you respond to that liquidated damages clause in that question?
I don't want to hang myself out to dry, but if I respond incorrectly,
Yeah.
but I tell them that their earnest money deposit is in jeopardy if they cancel after their contingency period. But I do my best to make sure that doesn't happen. I
Okay.
haven't had a liquidated damages issue to date. But
Yeah.
I make sure that we're following the contractual timelines and doing everything, timely, and not signing off on our contingencies until we're, absolutely certain.
Absolutely.
I do tell them their earnest money deposit is at risk if they cancel after signing off on their contingencies.
Okay. And
Right.
I'm not going to
I
bring
also,
names into the story, but we had a transaction years back where we were working on a transaction in Eagles Knoll Estates, where after the buyers had released contingencies, they canceled, and they did release their deposit because they had a compelling reason to do so.
That was me.
I wasn't going to name names, but
Well,
there
and
are.
then you tried to say at that time that, hey, no, you actually owe the full 3%. And I was like, no, I don't. Our contract was this amount. So yes, I did agree to, and it was my personal house, and I did agree to release the deposit. So thank you.
Yeah.
And it was me.
And I wasn't going to say that, but it's important that we know the circumstances about what we're doing. Okay. So I like to use what I call, it came from Danielle Kennedy. It's quick speak. We have to, one of the things that people value today is they value quick information. They want to get things quickly. They want to get, soundbite information. So I like to be able to give a very succinct answer to, these questions that we get. How can I lose my deposit? Well, when we present an offer, there's a whole lot of ways for you to get your deposit back. If the appraisal comes in short, if there's repairs to the property that are a necessity that you want that the seller is not willing to do, if you don't qualify for the financing, you would get it back. If they can't provide you clear title, I mean, there's a whole host of ways that the deal can cancel and you get your deposit back. There's really only one scenario in which you lose your deposit. And that means that all of the conditions have been met for you to move forward, and you've removed all of those contingencies. They've been satisfied, and you change your mind about buying. That's the only scenario in which you would lose your deposit.
I've had very, very rarely times when an escrow company will charge fees and take a fee out of the earnest money deposit. I, of course, fought it and said, no way. And it's happened a couple of times where they wanted to take fees out for the work they did while it was in escrow from the earnest money deposit. That clearly can't happen, correct?
No, I believe actually in the general instructions for most escrow companies, there are provisions in there that allow them to charge reasonable amounts for different things. In current practice, they don't usually do that. What you're describing, I think I've only heard or seen once or twice, and it was because of a particularly egregious behavior on the behalf of a buyer, where I think that took place. So.
Okay.
That's pretty rare, but I think in the general provisions for the escrow instruction, it does allow escrow to charge for time and effort if they feel it's necessary. Okay?
Mark, could we say how to lose money or EMD if the buyer cancels without cause? That seems to be the way. If you cancel with cause, the contingencies didn't come in. But without cause, just because he wanted to change his mind, that's when you lose the money, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I think there's a more technical answer to that, and it's when the contingencies are removed. Because I have seen buyers that canceled because they changed their mind during their contingency period and they used one of their contingencies as the excuse to get out.
Righto, right.
So, so a buyer that says, we decided we really don't want to be in Big Bear, and our loan isn't approved right now, or our lender's telling us we're having a problem, because interest rates are higher than we thought or whatever. So we haven't been approved for the loan we want, so we're getting out of the deal. I found it very hard for a seller to collect the deposit under those circumstances because the contractual right, the contingency was still in place. Make sense?
Righto. And after the contingencies are signed away, then with cause, you're likely to get the money back. The house burned down, the earthquake shook it to pieces.
Actually, that's not an automatic. There is a clause, a very little known clause in the purchase agreement that talks about what happens if the seller is unable to deliver the property because of fire destruction, and it goes into, if more than 50% is repaired and whose insurance does it. I mean, it's not a very well-known clause that's in there. In fact, I'd have to look and see if it's still in the current purchase agreement. But if the seller cannot deliver the property to the buyer in the condition that the contract calls for, the buyer would have a good argument to get their deposit back, even if they had removed their contingencies, because the seller is no longer able to provide the property, if that makes sense. So
yeah, I got to fess up though. I don't know that there's that. I don't know which clause you're talking about that gives the seller can't deliver. I don't know that one.
Yeah. Well, and it's an insurance clause. It's in one of the boilerplate things in the back that nobody ever reads is where it's at. So
Okay,
I will find it. I will find it, and when we send out the recap email, I will send that particular one to you with an explanation of it. So
yeah, forbid a
going,
forest fire or something like that, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, I think, it would be. Well, let me run through a scenario here. So let's say that we have a 30-day escrow, and on day 17, the seller says, remove all your contingencies, and the buyer does so. And on day 25, there's a forest fire that is threatening Big Bear, and so insurance is insurance is not available. The buyer would have a very difficult time closing, wouldn't they? But it wouldn't be the seller's fault. I'm trying to think of something that the seller would do that would create the fault. Well, oh, okay, so let me say this. So we promise to give clear title and we remove all of our contingencies, and on day 25, a lien comes out. A lien shows up that was not disclosed before. Maybe it's a child support lien that title finds, a week before close of escrow. And the seller says, I don't have the money to pay my outstanding child support lien, so I can't close the escrow. And the buyer has already removed their contingencies, and so their deposit is theoretically at risk. If you were going to protect the buyer, what would you do? Well, the buyer would give the seller a demand to close on the closing date. And once the seller refused to close because they don't have the money to pay the deal, then the buyer would be able to cancel and get his deposit back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good
And,
example.
and it wouldn't be because of the contingencies being removed. It would be a new contingency, which is a lack of performance on the behalf of the seller. That makes sense.
Very
Okay.
good.
Pretty complicated and technical stuff that we're going in, but these are good questions. So, going back, whether I'm presenting the offer to my buyer before they sign or whether I'm presenting an offer to my seller, I'm going to talk about all of the things that are in there that are going to affect either their finances or the ability of the transaction to close. What's the price? What's the down payment? What's the loan amount? Is the person pre-qualified? Have they shown their proof of funds? What's the escrow period? What's the amount of the deposit? Inspection periods, anything that, there's a lot of stuff that we know is pretty normal. It's boilerplate in there. We could call it standard, I guess is another way to say it, but there's always going to be things that are a little bit out of the ordinary. So if you get an offer from a buyer that says, I want a 90-day escrow, what would be your first question to the agent representing the buyer?
Well, I'd like to know why he wants 90, I mean,
Absolutely. That's perfect. If it's normal and customary to do something in 30 or 45 days, we want to know, why is it a 90-day escrow? Well, in 90 days, we get our, settlement from a big lawsuit. I don't know that that's a really good, or we're going to get an inheritance in 90 days kind of thing. So anything that's out of the ordinary is certainly going to, create a red flag. But another thing that we would be looking at also is, just because we get an offer that's written with boilerplate stuff in there, there are going to be times when we hear people say things, the other agent on the other side of the deal will say, well, they'll say something that doesn't match. They'll say something, oh, we need to sell some stock to get the down payment. Well, where did you get that proof of funds from? Kind of thing. So there are going to be things that don't really, you're going to hear things in your negotiations that sometimes don't match what's on the purchase agreement. Another question that we get from clients is, what happens if the inspections reveal problems? Okay. So it's important to know that our purchase agreement says that the buyer or the seller is going to sell the property in the condition that the buyer viewed it on the day of the offer. So it's Saturday, August 1st, and I walk through a house and I look at it and everything looks good to me. And I make an offer for 400,000 and the seller says, I'll sell it to you for 400,000. The seller's obligation in the purchase contract is to sell it in the condition that it was in on August 1st. But I also have the right to inspect it for 17 days. I have a due diligence period. So on day 17, I find cracks in the foundation and I find illegal wiring in the junction boxes. The seller's obligation is to sell it to me in the condition it was on August 1st. And the junction boxes were bad and there were cracks in the foundation there. I just didn't see them. As a buyer, I have the right to inspect it and I have 17 days to do that. I have three options when I find something about the house I don't like. Anybody want to share what they are?
First of all, I'd fire the home inspector.
Okay.
So we can fix all of them, some of them, or cash in lieu of repairs.
Okay. Okay. Well, actually, I was going to offer three different options. Yours always ends up with a yes, so that's good. Okay. But in reality, there are three options from my perspective. One is the buyer can say, I don't want to buy the house and they can cancel. It's not in the condition that I thought it was going to be. And all of us that have been around a while have had buyers that have made offers and were excited about a house on August 1st. And when August 17th came back, there were problems with the house and the seller was willing to repair them. But the buyer said, you know what? I'm no longer in love with this house. I fell out of in love when I saw that inspection period. So the buyer has the right to cancel when they find derogatory information by the 17-day due diligence period. We'll also at times see buyers that have buyer's remorse that change their mind will use a home inspection to cancel even though the work is pretty trivial. We've seen that happen as well, right? And they have the right to do that. The second option is and this goes more to where Bill was talking about, is to ask the seller to address the concerns that we have. They can, do all of them. They can do some of them. They can do none of them. And the buyer does have the right to inspect it and then go ahead and close even with the repairs not being done. Okay. So this would be a good warning that you don't want to spend your commission check until after the home inspection is done because you might lose the deal over it, right? Actually, don't spend your check until you receive it. That's even better advice, right? Okay. Anybody ever have somebody sign loan documents, do their final walkthrough, drive down the hill, die, and not close escrow? It happens. Don't spend your check before it happens. Okay, let's see. Any questions on the purchase agreement and how that works? We talked about what if the seller won't repair. We talked about when you're presenting to the client, always give three choices: full read through, short summary, and just sign. I like the short summary part, and I want to, visit that a little bit before we move on. Having a short summary or a real life scenario that you can share with somebody that you're working with will give them a practical application of the clause that they're asking about. At the sales meeting on Friday, I shared, my little story about agency, how I had represented a buyer and the listing agent gave me information that she should never have told me. And my client paid $2,500 less than he was intending to pay for the house because the other agent told me what she was in escrow with before. Now, as a buyer's agent, I have to be fair and honest with the seller, but I have a fiduciary duty to the buyer, which means any secrets the seller or the seller's agent tells me, I'm obligated to pass along to my buyer. Conversely, when you're representing a seller only, you have that same duty in reverse, where you have to be fair and honest with the buyer, but you have a fiduciary duty to the seller, and so any secrets that they say can be shared and should be shared with the seller. And so we'll come back to that open house visitor thing because that's the principle that is there that I wanted to share. But I like having little stories. I like having little stories, that explain these things. Um, can you guys think of another common problem that we see that we can share? And I'm trying to do a lot of these real life scenarios for Eric because he hasn't had any of them yet, other than being a buyer.
Well, I like war stories, and
Mhm.
early on, I would use war stories from other agents, uh, just as an example. And I think most of them will ring true if you're pretty sincere about it.
Mhm. Okay. Let me give you another example, a real life story about, and this is about transfer disclosure statements and, sellers disclosing. So, imagine you're put in the scenario where you are representing a seller and he presents you with a transfer disclosure and says everything's fine. And you close escrow, and a week later, the buyers come up for their first visit. It's Christmas time. And when they get there, the heater doesn't work. And so they call out a plumbing and heating specialist to get the heater working. And when the plumbing and heating specialist gets there, they say, this thing, I have to red tag it. It's got a cracked heat exchanger. And the buyer says, holy crow, how is that possible? I mean, it worked 3 weeks ago when we did our home inspection, right? It worked. I mean, the seller's TDS said it was fine, and home inspector didn't catch it. And we closed escrow. How is it possible that that heat exchanger is bad 2 weeks later? And the plumbing and heating specialist says, well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I was here 2 years ago and told the seller that the heat exchanger was cracked, and I turned it off then, and it has not been repaired ever since.
Fire
Anybody
the home inspector.
bad home inspector too? This one you would fire. Sometimes they miss things, okay? But in this particular case, what do you think we did? Maureen.
The seller should have disclosed it because they knew it as a material fact and they
Right.
didn't disclose it. So now you have a course of action. You could go after the seller for not disclosing something that they knew. And you have evidence that they knew because the contractor said they told them.
Perfect. Okay. So, key thing is in this particular case, the sellers did buy a brand new forced air unit for the buyers because that was the right thing to do. They should never have lied in the first place. But I think even more is what Maureen said was that we could actually prove that the seller had knowledge and failed to disclose it. That it made it a really easy case to win, right? Or it made it a really easy argument for us to win. Okay. So we've talked about purchase agreements. We've talked about having, short stories or real life examples. I mean, when I'm talking with a seller and they say, should I tell this kind of stuff? Or I'm talking with a buyer about the TDS, I tell them that story, is that you tell what you know. You tell what you know. If you don't know something, you can't get into trouble. If you don't know something, you can't get into trouble. It's a disclosure of what you know. But if you lie on it and they can prove it, you're going to be in trouble. And that's the truth of the transfer disclosure and the SPQ and the other disclosures as well. Okay. So having real life stories for every question that you get from your clients, buyer or seller, is a really effective way of explaining the consequences for the choices that they make on how they fill out their paperwork, if that makes sense. Okay. You're not giving them a legal interpretation. What you're doing is giving them a real life example of the consequences for doing the wrong thing. And I think that's probably worth everything that we're talking about today is if you go into the purchase agreement and you look at the questions that you get from your clients and you have a real life scenario where you can explain how it worked in real life to them, then you are not practicing law, but you are educating your client in the way that is helpful to them. Okay. Remember that we're salespeople. It's not the information. Everybody has information. Everybody has the contract. Everybody can say, read it for yourself. What we are doing is we're communicating to people in a way that helps them move forward and not make mistakes. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about counteroffers, acceptances, and deadlines, because I think that's a really important thing for people to be aware of. And it's funny, as we'll say, it's a 30-day escrow, or you have a 17-day due diligence period, and you've got 5 days to give the disclosures and blah, 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 blah. Okay. Let's talk about the timelines. The definition of an acceptance date is really the receipt of a fully executed purchase agreement. If a buyer signs an offer on Saturday and the seller signs it Monday morning at 8 o'clock, and it's not delivered to the buyer's agent until Wednesday, the acceptance date is Wednesday when the fully executed contract has been delivered to all parties. If it's sitting in somebody's inbox and it's not delivered to the other side, there is no acceptance. Acceptance has to be communicated. You guys should all write that down. Okay. Sometime we just had an issue not too long ago where somebody was complaining that there was a verbal acceptance on an offer, and another offer came in 3 days later, and the seller decided to take the new offer that came in 3 days later, and the buyer's agent on the first deal was crying foul, 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 foul. Well, if you don't even have it in writing and you haven't done, I mean, how can you argue that there's a contract if you don't even have it in writing, let alone having it delivered? It has to be delivered to all parties in order to be binding. Okay. In the old days, and this is in the old days, gosh, going back a long time, is if I had an offer that was, if I sent out a counter offer on a house at 400,000 and the other agent said, we're going to sign it and send it back to you, and I got another call from another agent saying, we're going to offer 425 on that house, you know what I wouldn't do? I wouldn't check my email until I got the new offer for 425 and had my seller sign it. And then what I would do is I would send an email to the first agent and say, I'm sorry to say another offer came in at 425 and the seller has accepted it. And they would say, but I sent you the 400,000 4 hours ago. I never got it. I never got it. Okay. They have changed that rule. So it's important that you know how counteroffers and other documents are now delivered. Is in your purchase agreement and in your listing agreements, there is a place for you to put your email address for delivery. And so you want to put the other agent's email address into the contract and have it signed, so that if you have a document that you want to have delivered to me, the minute you hit send and send it to me, it's considered delivered, even if I don't get it. If you can prove you sent me something at 12 midnight, that means that you have delivered it to me, even if I don't open it until 10 o'clock the next day. You guys all get that? It's important, okay? Delivery doesn't mean I have to see it. Delivery means it's sent to the email address that I'm contractually obligated to accept emails on the transaction. So question would be, is if you have a purchase agreement and you don't fill in the email address for delivery, then what happens? Now you have an argument, you have attorneys complaining about it, okay? So fill out your contracts completely, make sure that they're done properly so that you don't have to hire an attorney to decide what the intent of all the parties was. If you have the email address in the contract and you deliver your things timely, then there is no discussion about it. You don't need attorneys to interpret it for you, okay? So acceptance date is on the day that both sign and it's delivered, and that's when the timelines start. The acceptance date is day 0. It's not day 1, it's day 0. So if I get a signed contract in my inbox on Monday, that is day 0. Tuesday starts the first day. Tuesday is day 1. Acceptance is 0. The next day is day 1. The next important thing to know about is when these dates expire. Some things expire in 30 days, like the closing date. Some are contingency periods that expire on day 17. Sometimes you have a notice to perform that's, a 3-day window. Sometimes you have a demand to close, it's 2 days. I mean, you have these different dates that are there. When the last date ends on a Saturday, a Sunday, or a legal holiday, it automatically extends to the next business day. So let's say that you have your day 17 ends on a Saturday. It would be pushed to Monday unless Monday was the 4th of July holiday. So theoretically, you could have day 17 expire on or land on a Saturday, and it really wouldn't be contractually an obligation until Tuesday. Right? Okay. The other thing to be aware of is those deadlines for many of the things other than closing of escrow. I mean, if you haven't closed escrow by 5 o'clock on the day it's supposed to close, you're probably not closing it on that day because the escrow companies are closed and the county recorder's offices are closed. But all the other documents can be delivered up until 11:59 p.m. So if Tuesday is your 17th day and you get an email at 11:58 p.m., it's delivered on time. You can't send them a cancellation at 5:01 because they didn't deliver it to you by 5 o'clock. They have until 11:59 p.m. You guys all get that? I think that's important. Oh, oh, here's another thing I think is important, and it's regarding the contingencies. So we have a 17-day contingency period. What happens on day 17 when the buyer doesn't remove the contingency? What happens?
If I have the buyer, I make sure before the 17 days is up and I need an extension, I get that extension in.
Okay. So you ask for an extension to extend the contingency period, which is good practice. I mean, not only is it protecting your client, the buyer, on it, but it's also good negotiating and good behavior of being fair and honest with the people on the other side when you're trying to put a deal together. But I'm going to use the example of it's day 18 and you don't have an extension and the buyer didn't remove the contingency. What happens?
You do a notice to perform.
If you're representing the seller?
Yeah. And if
Okay.
you're representing the buyer, then shame on you for not communicating to the other side. I mean, my biggest thing is good, bad, or indifferent. As long as you communicate, you can usually work through most anything.
Yeah. Okay. So, I'm going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. Have you ever had a buyer whose ethics were a little bit less or a lot a bit less stringent than yours? And when you are a fiduciary for a buyer that's sort of not a nice person and you find yourself in that situation, it's pretty hard to navigate, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of factors, going into what it is that we're doing. We're the fiduciary even for the buyers that are jerks or the sellers that are jerks. We're still their fiduciary. And sometimes, we have to be really, really professional in how we go about what it is that we're doing. So, I'm going to go back to that day 18th. We don't have an extension. We don't have the contingency removed. The contingency remains in place until it's removed. So the phrase I want you to write down is on day 18, the buyer is out of contract in relation to their contingency removals. But that does not mean that the contingency does not exist. It remains.
Mark, can you comment on active removal versus passive removal and that change that happened years ago?
Yeah, yeah. Um, Back in the old days, we had what was called passive removal, which meant that if you had a 17-day contingency period and I'm representing the buyer and we say nothing on day 18, our silence deemed acceptance. It means we removed it passively. Because we didn't do something to extend it, because we didn't do something to complain, we just let the 17 days go and we got to day 18, the contingency was removed passively. Now, I have my own feelings about why they changed it. The way that the rule is today is that the contingency remains in effect until it's removed in writing. You could be at day 17 and you could tell the agent on the other side, hey, my buyers are happy with the house, we're fine, we're going to move forward. The contingency is still in place. 5 days later, they can decide that, they've got a hangnail on their toe and they're mad and they're not going to buy the house in Big Bear anymore. And because they have that contingency in place, they can use it. So it's important to make sure that the contingencies are removed, particularly when you are representing the seller, because it's harmful to their position. It might be just fine for a buyer to let that contingency ride forever, but it's not in the best interest of the seller. So in order to resolve it, Maureen went exactly to the right place as you give a notice to perform. And the notice to perform is basically saying to the other person on the other side of the transaction, hey, look, you've got a deadline on, August 18th, and we want that contingency removed. You have to give it to them enough days in advance in order to give them time and notice. You can't give them, notice like 30 seconds and then cancel them. You have to give them the 2 or 3 days that's in the form. Both of those forms, the demand to close and the notice to perform, both have 2 and 3 day deadlines that are required to give them in advance. You can't just do it and then cancel them right away. Okay. When you give a demand or a notice to perform, so let me give you this example. This is a real life example, and I'm not going to use the agent's name because some of you know them, but there was a really egregious real estate agent up in Big Bear about 20 years ago that was an absolute nightmare. And this guy was always doing crazy stuff. He was just a nightmare. So we had an agent that was a really difficult person to deal with, and the market was extremely hot. The market was extremely hot, and this guy was a bully. He was sneaky. He was everything that makes the real estate industry look bad. He wrote a book about it. That'll tell you, some of you will recognize it. So when we get to day 17, the contingencies don't get removed, and my client's property is off the market in one of the hottest markets in the Big Bear has ever seen, and this guy's jerking my client around. So we sent them the notice to perform, and the time expired. The time expired. Is the deal canceled when the time expires? If I give a notice to perform for somebody to remove a contingency for inspections or a loan or anything else, and they don't do it, if I give them a notice to perform and 3 days goes by and they still don't remove the contingency, is the deal canceled?
I want to say yes, but I would have to look at the language on the notice to perform to see if it allows for that.
The answer is no, it's not. Okay. What that notice to perform does is it gives the seller the right to cancel. Very important distinction. Because with this particular agent, I think our 3-day notice expired on a Monday, and the weekend was over, and I quietly put the property back into the MLS active. I quietly put it back into the thing active because we had the right to cancel. If we would have got another offer that my seller wanted to take, all we had to do was send the cancellation and we were done because we had the right to do it. It wasn't a threat. It was simply protecting the client. my client.
I thought that's what I said.
No, you said it was canceled. No, it's not canceled until you deliver a cancellation.
Okay, so,
We
but you
we
have the
have the
right
we
to
have the
act as
right
if
to
it's
cancel.
canceled.
So
So you can put it back as active without having a signed cancellation?
well, without delivering the cancellation, sure. I mean, I could have had a cancellation to this particular agent in 5 minutes, if I needed to. But what I was doing is I was trying to protect my buyer. So we had a deal that we wanted to close, but they weren't behaving. And the market was hot, so we gave a notice to perform and allowed my seller the option to cancel and go on with a new buyer. If I never issued the notice to perform, we would not have been able to cancel if we got a better offer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we couldn't do anything. So the end of that story is on Tuesday. On Tuesday, I got a call from the assistant of this particular agent. And she said, we're thinking about, maybe we'll remove contingencies by the end of the week. I said, that's okay. I already put the property back active. 15 minutes later, I had the contingency removal in my inbox. Okay. So it's important to know how the contracts work and what the chain of events are to make sure that you are protecting your client contractually. You want to be able to use them to protect them, both from staying in deals when they want to stay in deals and getting out of deals when there's people that are behaving badly. That makes sense, okay? Any questions on that? Because I think that was pretty technical there. No question? Okay. Cancellation. So let's assume that, in this particular case, we decided to cancel the transaction and we send a cancellation to the other party and we ask them, we offer to give them their deposit back. What happens when the buyer says, what happens when the buyer says, well, I'm not signing that. I don't want to cancel. I'm not going to sign it.
Isn't there something where both parties don't have to sign anymore?
That's correct. So here's what's important about it is we have all of these documents in this chain of paperwork. We have contingency periods, we have notice to perform, we have time frames that we have to meet or that we have to wait for, and then we have a cancellation. If I have a valid reason to cancel a transaction, my seller can cancel unilaterally. They don't need the buyer to agree to cancel the deal. They don't need two people to cancel a deal. Now, the buyer may argue that you don't have the legal right to cancel, but if you've done your notice to perform and your cancellation notices properly and you have all of your ducks in a row, you can cancel and there's nothing that the buyer can do about it except whine. So when a buyer whines and says, well, I'm not signing that cancellation, all that means is that the buyer's not going to get his deposit back until he signs. Because there's two parts to the cancellation document. The top is the seller says, I'm canceling because, they failed to, perform. The second part down below requires both signatures, and that means what do we do with the deposit? Does it go back to the buyer? Does it go to the seller? Where does the deposit go? Okay. So the top half, if it's signed properly, means that the deal is canceled. The bottom part, if it's not signed properly, means that the deposit is going to stay in escrow. It cannot be dispersed by escrow until one of two things happen. You have mutually signed instructions from both parties. That means the buyer and seller have to both agree what to do with the deposit, or they need a court order telling the escrow company disperse it to the seller or disperse it to the buyer. Okay. For anybody that's questioning, usually deposits don't sit in escrow all that long. I mean, people will moan and complain for a week or two sometimes, but usually after the dust settles and the anger goes away, they'll take their money back and move on most of the time. Okay. So last point that I want to make, and we are running right at an hour, is best practices. The best practices, and I know a lot of you have heard Gov Hutchison talk about this, but I want to remind you guys the same thing, is that if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. If it's not in writing, it does not exist. And by the nature of our business, where we're talking with other agents, and when we are talking with sellers, and we're talking with vendors, and we're talking with a bunch of different people in a transaction, we might have paperwork that has, 75 pieces of paper in it, but a lot of the negotiation is stuck in our head. And if there's a problem with the deal, and I go in and I tell an attorney or a judge, well, this is what happened, and the other person says, this is what happened, and the third person says, no, 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 this over here happened. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So you have three people arguing. The he said, she said kind of thing. And people lie, right? People lie. Okay. I hate to say it, but people lie. So your best practice is to make sure that your paperwork is bulletproof and that you have it right. But you also want to confirm your conversations in writing wherever you can. In the old days, people used to have on the outside of their file folders, they'd write notes, gave the seller an update on the pricing today. I asked for a price reduction. They said no. Oh, we went into escrow, blah, blah, blah. They'll have notes all over the outside of their folders. We don't do that anymore. What we do is we have these conversations, and then you send a follow-up email. And the follow-up email says, hey, Maureen, I just wanted to confirm our conversation where we discussed the purchase agreement and these terms today. You did not want to read through the rest of the contract. You felt comfortable enough with it, to avoid that exercise. And I'm looking forward to a successful transaction. What did I just say? We talked about it. You didn't want to read through every single thing there. You felt comfortable enough about it. That email prevents a buyer from coming back to you later saying, you know what, you never explained the fire insurance rule that if the house burned down, that I was going to have consequences. You never explained that. Well, when we talked about it, you said you were comfortable enough with the contract to sign it, and my email confirmed that, and you never disputed it when I sent you the email. So what you want to do is you want to have these conversations with your clients and give them the best information and do things the right way. But also from a risk management standpoint, you follow up in writing on the verbal conversations that you have to get clarification and to document your file. If something that you said is incorrect in the email, they'll tell you. They'll tell you. Okay. And then you can address it then on the spot. Okay. Okay, so I'll leave you guys with some homework if you should choose to do it. And this would be a really good thing for you in particular, Eric, is to have somebody give you the highlights, have somebody tell you to write a purchase agreement and then sit down and explain all of it to somebody, explain what the clauses mean and practice doing that. Okay. Always highlight when you're doing it, the contingency period, the arbitration, the deposit risks, the cost cancellation rights. That's one thing we didn't talk about today was arbitration. We'll deal with that some other time. But role play with a client who says, just let me sign. Yeah, just let me sign. What do you say to somebody when they say, give me the short version? How do you explain your offer in 5 minutes? What you're asking them to sign, all of the things that we talked about, purchase price, deposit amount, all of that kind of stuff. Training exercises to practice doing it. As much as it seems like it is crazy to practice, I'm a big believer in practicing on people that are not going to cost you thousands of dollars when you screw up. I mean, I would rather screw up in front of Sarah than I would in front of a client that's buying a $2 million property. I don't want to screw up in front of them. Okay. I'd rather practice with people that are safe. Not only do I get better, but they get better at the same time. Okay. So I think that is all of the information that I had to share with you guys. Great participation today. Thank you all for, sharing your experiences and your best practices and your ideas. And I hope going forward, that we're all just a little bit better and that we'll revisit this again in a year as a reminder. Okay?
Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you.
Thank you, guys.